thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the call. It seems this debate needs to be grounded for a moment in the reality of new democracies. And that is, in particular, in those places, not even the best policy helps everyone. The best policy in a new democracy often leaves a vast number of people disadvantaged. That is the notion of having a limited number of resources and a poor economic situation in a lot of places. What the opposition bench wanted to stand behind was the rights of those people who were left disadvantaged to destabilise the overall progress of that very same democratic notion that would eventually bring them stability and prosperity. We said that if you felt disenfranchised with what your government that you elected was doing, vote them out on the next piece of ballot paper that gets handed to you. We never heard from the opposition bench what a protest does or why it's an effective mechanism to try and get a government who has already ignored the needs of your people to change. We said it wasn't effective, and it makes that ineffective mechanism the primary norm in a new democracy for enacting change. But most important, Mr. Speaker, we told you in our extension that it was a fundamentally dangerous notion to allow these types of protests to occur because they undermine the institutions that will go on to protect those democracies into the future. So 2 questions in refutation to you, sir. Firstly, is a protest an effective tool for change? And secondly, does it improve the stability in the long term? So to this first question of whether or not it's an effective tool. We heard that the government is in control of the media in all new democracies. We said this was patently untrue, but even if we took their argument at its best and conceded that the government has influence upon the media, we said that if you take the cases of Iran, where Twitter was the fundamental tool that was used by protesters to best enact and mobilize change in that country, whereas the people who protested in the street got arrested and shot, Mr. Speaker. We said that if people have the option to use those sorts of media forms, people have the option to do so from the safety of their own home. That's the way you pressure for change. What did the protesters in Iran achieve besides getting shot, Mr. Speaker? Absolutely nothing. So we said, telling people that the norm for protesting issues in your country was to go out and get shot by the people in control, then that wasn't a notion we wanted to stand behind. But if you turn to somewhere like China, where bloggers were influential in the movement towards granting more property rights to people, and contrast that to people who went out and protested on the street towards their rights, they ended up arrested and beaten, Mr. Speaker, by the police. We said that belligerent governments do not take respect of the views of their people, and that's probably the reason why people feel disenfranchised in the first place. The best way to deal with that, Mr. Speaker, is to give your vote to somebody else. And we said that was the mechanism that works all the way through stable democracies, and creating that as the notion for the best mechanism to change in new democracies is the best way to ensure that people use their ballot paper first, no thank you, and don't risk their lives and their safety and the reputation of their causes by going out and getting beaten up by the police, Mr. Speaker. We said, no thank you, that in order to make the government aware of your issues, you don't do so in a mob rule that can so easily be hijacked with people who have different agendas to your own. We said the best way to communicate a reasoned stance to your government, the best way to ensure that opposition dissent is heard, is by having a free and effective media, no thank you, is by ensuring that people choose to vote in an opposition party rather than supporting a violent movement to overthrow the people involved. We said that not all protests are violent, Mr. Speaker, but all protests in new democracies, especially in new democracies, no thank you, are particularly vulnerable to people who'd like to make them violent. And we said that risk was too great to the people involved, especially when those protests rarely have the types of effects that they wanted them to have. I'll take closing.
You're exactly right. The reason that they have to resort to violence is because that media is failing and is because the government is not listening to the people's voice. How is it that you have checks and balances if you don't allow people to protest?
No. So what has a protest ever done? You've never got up here and told us that the protest ever brings the type of demands that you want. I'll take opening if you've got an example.
Look, your extension is the fact that these electoral commissions, these laws, and these institutions completely work well in a new democracy. Voting works in a new democracy. Is that what you're extending on?
No. What we said was, Mr. Speaker, that when you allow people to protest, you fundamentally undermine the movement towards stabilising these institutions that will allow them to have a safe and secure democracy with which to engage in the future. We are about realising that new democracies aren't perfect. They don't please everyone. They don't have perfect institutions. But the way you make them closer and closer towards that notion is by not undermining the institutions that create long-term change in those formative years. Note that there was not an example brought up in that opportunity to show where a protest has successfully brought about the type of change that those protesters saw. We showed you how using the media and how using opposition parties in East Timor through their independent media there was a perfect example of how you can bring about change, and Iran and China were perfect examples of how you get shot, Mr. Speaker. So now let's move to this second question of creating long-term stability. We had this assertion that protests were used as a method of last resort, and only when you're in desperate need of change. So there are countless examples all throughout the world where protests are held on a huge range of issues that don't necessitate a life or death decision between being oppressed and being free. We said that the cases where this is most relevant, where governments have already ignored the wishes of their people. So at what point does creating civil disobedience for a government that has already shown a complete disregard for their obligations to their people, no thank you, to change based on that protest? We said the more likely scenario, especially when the norm in that country is to use force to retaliate, and that is the norm in a lot of new democracies, was to in fact create a precedent for retaliating. Or worse, Mr. Speaker, charge people with arbitrary crimes like treason or destabilising the country. We said this ability to cloud entire protests with a bad name and destroy the reputation of that movement, or worse still, harm those people, was a much more detrimental effect. We said the best way to get out somebody who is the last resort is to vote them out, because that ensures you get a new party in power who's not going to ignore you like the preceding one, Mr. Speaker. We heard that violent protesters are effectively punished under the status quo. We said the opening opposition conceded that they were happy to place restrictions on the right to protest when they supported the model of Singapore and Thailand. We said the closing government pointed to France, where hundreds of innocent protesters were caught up by the needs of violent people to mar their protests by just turning up and starting fights, Mr. Speaker, because it's pretty hard to tell who in that violent protest, who were all wearing the same shirts and carrying the same banners, were truly the ones who were violent in the first place, Mr. Speaker. We said that was the fundamental risk in this debate. So what did we bring you as our extension, sir? We said protests in new democracies threaten the very institutions that are going to protect the long-term stability and the prosperity of the people involved. And just because you disagree, or just because you're disenfranchised, doesn't give you a right to undertake a mechanism that could destabilise your country, get you killed, and not have any of the results that you really wanted to in the first place. That's why we stood in proud proposition. Thank you.
Hear, hear.